Welcome to Session 2, Video 1. We're moving on to Chapter 3 now, and we're going to start talking about how ethics is a part of marketing and the social responsibility mandate that companies are increasingly being forced to adopt based on the demands of customers. So we're going to start talking about sustainable marketing, and really this is an umbrella term to talk about or to introduce the idea of marketing in ways that are socially responsible and ethical when it comes to the way consumers are being treated. Socially and environmentally responsible marketing that meets the needs of customers while preserving the ability of future generations to meet their own needs is a growing concern for consumers, and companies are responding to that concern by coming up with creative new um, ideas, products, innovations to demonstrate to customers their commitment to sustainable marketing and sustainable business practices, and customers are demanding that and rewarding those companies that actually are responsive to those kinds of needs. So this is just a visual representation of where we're going when it comes to sustainable marketing. Increasingly, consumers are thinking not just about the value that they personally derive from a product in terms of making their life easier or whatever. They're also looking to derive value that is tied to the broader community. They're looking for ways in which their purchases can do good in the world, whether that's through supporting small local businesses and encouraging the local economy, to supporting those businesses that develop more environmentally friendly or green practices. Consumers are increasingly turning towards those kinds of factors when making consumer-based decisions. We're going to move on now and talk just a little bit about the various ways in which marketers or marketing is criticized as having potentially a negative impact on individuals and the broader community. And one of those ways that marketing is criticized is through the high prices. Many consumer advocates argue that many of the things that marketers do in relation to price, remembering that price is one of those 4 P's of marketing, there is an argument by critics of marketing that the way marketers use pricing is unethical. Many critics criticize the high cost of getting products into the hands of consumers. So, for example, shipping goods and services, but mostly goods across thousands and thousands of miles, when in fact a more localized solution to a problem might be more efficient, is in fact a negative thing that marketers are doing, that we're demanding a more global array of products and services, but with that comes really high distribution costs and actually the environmental costs that go along with transporting those goods and services. One of the biggest ones or criticisms of marketing actually comes in the form of the cost of advertising and promotion. The reality is every time a company advertises or promotes their product, it costs enormous amounts of money, and in order to recoup that money, the company has to add that into the cost of their products and services. For example, when Nike pays LeBron James or another famous athlete millions and millions of dollars to endorse or wear their products, they recoup the cost of paying those athletes by embedding the sponsorship costs into the cost of the shoe itself. When a company pays a couple of $1 million to air a commercial during the Super Bowl, well, they have to recoup that cost by building the cost of that advertisement into the cost of the product. So critics of marketing say, well, if we didn't do so much advertising and promotions, our costs of products would go down. And another criticism of pricing strategies when it comes to marketing is excessive markups. There are products, most people believe that companies who make products deserve to make a living, deserve to make money if their product is in fact good. But what the criticism is that many companies are overcharging for their product, well in excess of what is a reasonable amount of money. And so companies are being criticized for excessive markups, co- costing consumers a lot more money to buy the goods that they're looking to buy. Other criticisms of marketing include other deceptive practices, could be tied to pricing. For example, I don't know how many of you are able to decipher exactly how the cost of your monthly cell phone service is broken down. I couldn't tell you at all. I just know that I get a bill in my email inbox on a monthly basis, and it never seems to be the amount that I signed up to pay. So the way in which I'm being charged is so complicated that the average consumer, like myself, really doesn't have the time or the inclination to figure out exactly how that pricing works. Other examples of deceptive pricing, when I go to the grocery store and I see a sign on a shelf that says 2 for $5. What the marketers are trying to do is they're trying to get me to buy two of the products rather than one. And they usually, in very, very small print, if you look carefully, it'll say, or one for $2.50. So there's really actually no financial incentive, no pricing incentive for you to buy more of the product. They're just displaying that or encouraging you to buy more by deceptively telling you what the price is for multiple units. So pricing in deceptive ways is a problem. Promotion. Um, some examples of deceptive promotion include anything weight loss related, where they show usually a woman, not always, but usually a woman who, in 6 weeks magically transforms her body by using a certain program or a certain product to lose weight or to get fit. And at the very, very bottom of the screen, in very, very small print, you can read the disclaimers that the results aren't typical and they vary and et cetera, et cetera. But the promotion itself, unless you dig deeper into the information, the promotion itself sets people up for disappointment. The results aren't realistic and aren't typical for the average user and therefore are considered to be unethical. Another example of unethical promotion actually centers around kids, for example. I remember when my son was younger and he would see an advertisement on TV for a toy, the toy always performed in a way that the average child would never be able to make that toy perform. So, for example, if it was one of those toy squirt guns that squirts water, it would shoot water in the commercial, a great distance. But when an actual kid plays with the toy, it barely goes a few feet. And so it encourages children to believe that they can actually perform these kinds of feats with the products. But in actuality, the average child's not going to be able to do that. There's also deceptive practices when it comes to packaging. One of the ones that was in the news in the last couple of years, potato chip companies were looking for ways to reduce costs, and so they wanted to reduce in order to reduce costs without really letting the customer know, what they did was they actually reduced the weight or the amount of potato chips in a standard potato chips bag. So they kept the bag size the same. The only difference was in the volume or the amount of potato chips in the bag. Most people didn't realize that there was actually less potato chips in the bag because we don't typically look at the weight of the bag when we're making the purchases. We look at the size of the bag. The size looks exactly the same as the size I've always bought. So why would I think that the company was actually shortchanging me by providing me less potato chips but charging me the same price? So there can be some challenges around packaging as well, and deception around packaging. The other criticism of marketing is what's called greenwashing. Greenwashing is all about when companies sort of pretend that they care about the environment. They suggest or imply or outright say that they're making bold, innovative steps to protecting the environment, when in actual fact, if you dig a little bit deeper, those activities really don't amount to much in terms of positive impact on the environment. Other social criticisms of marketing include high pressure selling, salespeople who refuse to take no for an example and prey on people who are vulnerable or uninformed, and who perhaps can't afford the kind of product that they're selling. That's considered an unethical practice. And selling unsafe products, products that don't work the way they're supposed to, or actually harm the individual. Things like we actually see an enormous amount of regulation now, marketing cigarettes. There's very strict regulations around that because the products themselves are unsafe. They're harmful to individuals, and so government heavily regulates how those can be marketed. Same goes for alcohol. You still can do some marketing around alcohol, but there's very, very strict rules around how that has to work. So that's really another social criticism of marketing. The next one we're going to talk about is called planned obsolescence. And you may not have heard this term before, but I suspect many of you have actually experienced planned obsolescence. Apple is accused of doing this on a fairly regular basis. And this is all about using inferior materials or components to make products break more easily. That's not what Apple's typically accused of. Then it's the next one on the list, the continuously changing of acceptable styles. Apple is known for introducing new versions of their products in relatively short time frames. And what they end up doing every time they introduce a new model of the iPhone, for example, is they render the older versions of the iPhone less socially acceptable or less stylish or less trendy. And it encourages people to upgrade their phone perhaps more earlier than they actually needed to do so. And Apple is heavily criticized for doing that, along with other technology companies. Apple responds to those criticisms by saying customers are looking for the latest in technology and they want to get that technology into the hands of consumers as quickly as possible, and therefore every time they make a major advance on a product, they want to make that available to consumers before their competitors do. So those are some of the ways planned obsolescence is a social criticism of marketing. There are some protections in place for consumers when it comes to protecting them from unethical behavior by marketers. There's actually some legislative laws on the books from the Competition Bureau that specify exactly what marketers can and cannot do. There's legislation that protects customers. For example, the Ontario Consumer Protection Act, and most jurisdictions have something very similar to that. We have the Canada Consumer Product Safety Act that sets guidelines in terms of the functionality of products and making sure those products are safe for consumers to use. So there are actually some legislative and regulatory things that government has done to protect consumers. But actually, one of the greatest ways to protect consumers now is actually social media. Consumers now have such a powerful voice when it comes to their consumer activity, and if they're displeased or dissatisfied with a company or a product or a brand, their voice is now amplified through the use of social media, and they can inform other consumers about shoddy products or deceptive practices, and consumers can take it actually into their own hands. Consumers are increasingly more powerful today than they were in previous years, and that's a good thing for consumers. Some of the other fundamental criticisms of marketing, though, that reach sort of society as a whole, less the individual consumer, but society as a whole, is that marketing really does encourage materialism. It encourages us to evaluate ourselves and others, not by who we are as individuals, but by what we own. And that's a very discouraging concept, to think that we value people and we strive to have more and more and more, when the reality is there's lots of people in this world who have next to nothing, and I'm not really sure that most of us, if we really think about it, would agree that evaluating people or judging people based on what they own is not really a great way to behave. Overselling private goods. Marketing is all about, and the North American consumer system is all about ownership. home ownership, car ownership. All the American ideal is to have, you know, a home with a white picket fence and two cars and a dog, and so marketers encourage us, rather than to find innovative ways to maybe share products and to do things like use public transportation. Marketing encourages us to focus on individual ownership of goods rather than things that might be a bit more environmentally and socially responsible. And one of the last social criticisms of marketing is that it creates cultural pollution, meaning that it's very, very difficult for any individual to completely avoid being the recipient of marketing messages. It doesn't matter where you go. It's now even on the bathroom stall doors, above urinals, bus stops. It's proliferating your cell phone. It's very, very hard to get away from marketers. Marketers are trying to basically chase down consumers and force their messages on you, and that's what's called creating cultural pollution. And consumers are very resentful of that, especially the younger generation, who are much more deliberate in their attempt to avoid marketing messages, doing things like streaming television content or movie content in a direct effort to avoid marketing messages. So that's another social criticism of marketing. And lastly, in terms of social criticisms of marketing, sometimes marketing practices can reduce competition by reducing the number of competitors in the marketplace and by creating barriers to entry. For example, if you wanted to start your own running shoe company, you'd be at a severe disadvantage compared to a company like Nike, who has spent millions, probably billions of dollars on developing their brand and marketing, promoting, advertising their brand. And so for you as this new entrant in the marketplace, it's very, very difficult for you to compete with a brand like Nike. And also doing things like unfair practices such as predatory pricing. Walmart gets accused of this quite regularly. The reality is Walmart is able to charge a lot lower prices for products based on an incredibly efficient distribution system. But what ends up happening is Walmart enters a market, a community, and it ends up driving out small, locally owned businesses who simply cannot compete on pricing. Sometimes that's done unintentionally, meaning that Walmart really is just more efficient, and should they be penalized for being more efficient? But sometimes Walmart has been accused of undercutting their pricing, pricing their products even below their own costs in an effort to penalize or punish local businesses and ultimately result in those small businesses closing and then Walmart having those market areas all to themselves. So stay tuned for video number 2 in just a moment.